My name is Rich Pizzolo. I'm NEHA's Executive Director, and we are so excited that you are here with us this evening for our 8th webinar Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So these platforms have been created to help the New England bleeding disorder community and our friends in other places stay connected during this public health emergency. If you are here for the first time, welcome. We're so glad that you are here with us. If you're back again for week 2, 3, or maybe 8, we're so glad that you have come back to join us on a Wednesday evening. We're very excited this evening, for those that saw Joe's presentation a month ago, to have Dr. Joe Schwartz back with us tonight. The webinar is entitled Humor, Magic, and Medicine, which I think is one of the most intriguing webinars that I've seen so far since this all started. So Joe is back by popular demand. I'm just going to read a quick bio about Joe. Joe is the director of McGill University's Office for Science and Society. Joe is well known for his informative and entertaining public lectures on topics ranging from the chemistry of love to the science of aging. Being on one end of a microphone and in front of a television camera for 40 years has afforded Joe with fascinating insight into public's perceptions of science. We are so appreciative for Joe's time tonight, as I know you are involved with many programs and publications. So before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of things. This is our second week using Zoom for our webinars. We were using GoToMeeting, but the feedback is we wanted to be able to see people and interact a little bit more. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, feel free to play around with the speaker view. When Joe comes in his presentation, you can slide that back and forth. Everyone will remain on mute, but if you have questions, please use the chat feature as we want this to be interactive at the end. Your camera, you can turn it on, you could turn it off. This is being recorded so that we can share it with folks that are not here with us this evening. Again, the chat feature is up the entire evening tonight, so please use that. And thank you, Sarah, because there's a lot of great information for Zoom if you're new there in the chat feature itself. So without further ado, as we do with most of our programming, we're going to do some live polling. So if you have your phone handy, we're going to use that. So please get your phone out, and I'm going to share my screen here. Let me get this. So the first question is, we like to know, what state do you live in? So we have Massachusetts, Maine, the New Hampshire states, and then outside of New England. So all you need to do is text 781-412-7971, and we will let this go live for a minute just to see where everyone is from. So it looks like we have outside, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Let's see, we'll give it another minute or so here, or a couple of seconds. Great. Massachusetts is definitely the majority of folks. Maine, glad to see Maine represented there. Awesome. All right, we're going to move on to the next poll here. Since humor is part of the title tonight, what's your favorite comedy movie or TV show? This is a word cloud, so it could be anything that you are, interested in. So you could just text the name of your favorite comedy movie or TV show. We have Friends, Ellen, yes, Modern Family, two of my favorites there. Last Man Standing, Whose Line Is It Anyway? The Office. Fuller House, great to represent that. Studio C, some really great examples of comedy and movie and TV shows. Studio C, so when they get larger, means multiple people said that. I've not seen Studio C, so I'm gonna have to add that to my list. We're gonna go on to the next question. Some of you have seen this before. What is one word to describe how you are feeling right now? There is no right or wrong answer to this. So you can write whatever you would like. Quarantined, well, frustrated, excited, overwhelmed, better, which is all great words here. And we hope that this hour that we spend together through the computer can help with some of this. Tired as well, crazy. I see these words as well too. Content, multiple people said that. Then the last question that we do, we just want to have a mental health check-in. We think this is really important to do to make sure that you know that you're not alone, that one NEHA's here for you, our hemophilia treatment centers are here for you, and that you have a wicked strong family behind you. So texting 1, I'm doing really great, all the way to text 6 that I need to reach out for support. So we have the majority people that are saying I'm doing pretty good, and then we have a couple that are starting to struggle and having a hard time. If you put that, please always know that you can reach out to us. We have monthly phone calls with the social workers, and I know that we will do whatever we can to connect you, to help you, and know that you are not alone with this. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Joe. Joe, if you could share your screen, I will have you take it from here.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the new world. And unfortunately, that's what it is. It's going to be a long time before we get back to anything that we used to think was normal. And I'm kind of surprised at your choices for comedy. How can you not have Seinfeld up there? The best that ever was, the best that ever will be. All right. Anyway, no admonishment for that. Let's get it going. One day there were 3 guys, and they were sitting around a campfire, and they were kind of shooting the breeze. And one of them asked a question, what would you guys do if you went to the doctor and you were told that you have 3 months left to live? Well, a friend piped up and he said, you know what, I think I would go and buy a ticket for a cruise around the world. This was pre-COVID days. And I would enjoy myself because I think I could never do that again. What would you do? They asked the next one. Said, well, you know, I don't think I could do that. I think I would be so despondent, I would just sit in a room at home and wait for the eventuality to set in. And what would you do? They asked to the originator of the question. And he said, you know what, if I went to the doctor and he told me that I had 3 months left to live, I think I would go and get a second opinion. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, because nobody knows exactly what the outcome of a health situation is. And when you make a dire prediction, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There are ways to deliver bad news. You don't have to be direct. You can always offer some hope, not false hope, of course. And no one can ever be certain of what is going to happen. So this is sort of the theme that we're going to discuss, the connection between the body and the mind. Well, we know, of course, that there is a connection between the body and the food that we eat. We've often heard the expression, you are what you eat, right? Well, that's not just an old adage. That is actually a statement of scientific fact. Think about it for a moment. Food is the only raw material that ever goes into our body. So obviously we must be constructed of what we eat. The body is a fascinating machine. It takes the food, it breaks it down into components, it reassembles those components and builds our muscles, builds our fatty tissues, builds our brain, etc. So obviously there has to be a connection between the food that we eat and how we feel and what we are. That's a given. But you know, there's also a connection between what we think and what we are, because the brain is a fascinating organ. And it's not exactly the same as the mind. The brain is the physical entity. The mind is what the brain can actually do. You can put the brain, of course, in a bottle. You can't put the mind in a bottle. But there's a connection between, excuse me, between the mind and the body, and about what we think. We know, for example, that when we eat the wrong things, we get sick. Well, when we think the wrong thoughts, the same thing can happen because of this connection between whatever goes on in our brain and what happens in the body. And there are many interesting stories that one can tell, but to start with, let's go back to the days of Hippocrates, the best known of the ancient Greek physicians. Now, in those days, of course, they didn't know very much about science. They knew hardly anything about health. And yet, when Hippocrates or any other physician came to an ill person and just placed their hand on them and said, I think you're going to be okay, they felt a lot better. Even though there was no physical action taken, but it was the comforting action of the words. And doctors, since time immemorial, have been placed on a pedestal. Why? I mean, think about this for a moment. Until really the last century, physicians were not able to do very much. What did they do? They purged patients, they bled patients, they tortured them back to health, until the patient said, enough, I feel better. Nevertheless, very often just the presence of a physician giving some substance, even though it may have been totally ineffective, resulted in some sort of happiness for the patient. So this, of course, is a connection between the body and the mind. Bloodletting went on for 2,500 years before we figured out that this really was not a thing to do, aside, of course, from hemochromatosis. How is it then that so many people were satisfied with this treatment and got better? Of course, it all came from the mind. Because if you think that some intervention is going to do you good, about 30 to 40% of the time, it does. It can make you feel better. But a very important point to understand here, and I stress this all the time, is that feeling better is not the same as being better. The mind does not cure a disease, but the mind can change the perception of the disease. It can certainly change the perception of pain. It can change how you feel, but it will not alter the underlying physiology. Let's for a moment go back to Vienna in the 18th century. And the public there was entertained by two young men. One very young, that was young Mozart, who played piano concertos at the age of 5. I mean, absolutely stunning, right? And someone else who captivated the imagination of people in Vienna at that time, another young man, a little bit older than Mozart, was Anton Mesmer. Mesmer had graduated from medical school, and he learned what you normally learned in those days in medical school. What did you learn? You learned how to bleed patients, how to purge patients, how to basically, as I mentioned, torture them back to health. But Mesmer thought that there must be a better, kinder, gentler therapy. He didn't like to purge his patients, make them vomit, etc. Interesting enough, he had developed a fascination with magnets. And magnets indeed are fascinating, aren't they? We still don't have a complete understanding of how magnets work. I mean, think about it for a moment. You can take a magnet, put it on one side of your hand, put a piece of metal on the other side, and there's an attraction. There's obviously some force that is going through the body. And Mesmer was intrigued by this. And he wondered whether or not magnetism could have some kind of effect on the body. It was not an outrageous thought at all. In fact, it still isn't an outrageous thought. There are actually some experiments that have been done that show that the application of magnets in a few very rare cases, such as arthritis of the knee, can maybe have some sort of an effect. I think it mostly has been overstated, but it's not a totally ridiculous phenomenon that magnets can somehow interact with the body. Well, he decided to put this to a test. And of course, in those days, you didn't have ethics committees or anything like that. If you wanted to try something, you tried it. So he installed these, what he called magnetized rods in his clinic. And patients came and they held onto these magnetized rods to have the disease drawn out of their body. And of course, many of them were very happy because it was a lot better than having to be bled or to be purged. The physicians in Vienna, however, were not happy because Mesmer was stealing their patients, because it was a lot more attractive to come and hold on to these metal rods than to undergo the usual medical treatments at the time. So they kind of got together and they essentially forced Mesmer to leave. And he went and he set up shop in Paris. And by this time, he had come to a very interesting conclusion. He concluded that healthy humans also were magnetizers. And the same way that a physical magnet could draw disease out of the body, a healthy person had what he called animal magnetism. And this could also be used to heal people. So he opened up a healing salon in Paris, where the famous and rich came to be cured of diseases that they probably never had. They suffered from various kind of psychosomatic problems. And here, of course, Mesmer's treatment came to the fore. Now, very often the patients were young women. And remember that social mores were very different in those days. So the young women would come and they would sit knee to knee next to good-looking young men to have the disease drawn out of their body. Seemed like a pleasant experience. In fact, Mesmer recorded in his diary that some of these ladies had to be taken to the back room for further therapy. He never mentioned what that further therapy was. The same way that he ran afoul of the doctors in Vienna, Mesmer ran afoul of the physicians in Paris. They also were losing business. And they thought that this was a lot of bunk to heal with basically animal magnetism. And the king at that time decided that this merited looking into. And he formed a committee. And the committee included Antoine Lavoisier, who was the most famous French scientist at that time, Joseph de Guillotine, a physician, who had suggested the use of guillotine during the French Revolution out of kindness, because he thought that if people were going to be killed, at least do it quickly and mercifully. And the third member of the committee was Benjamin Franklin, who was the American ambassador to France at that time. And the committee investigated Mesmer, and they came to an interesting conclusion. They concluded that yes, people felt much better, but it didn't really matter because it was all coming from the mind. And therefore, they decided that the therapy was useless. Interesting conclusion to come to, because they actually admitted that many of the patients felt better, and yet they deemed the treatment to be not worthy. Mesmer left Paris and he went back to Austria, basically died in obscurity. But of course, we still remember him today because of the term mesmerism, named after him. And mesmerism is really using the power of the mind to affect what the body can do. Well, today, mesmerism takes on many different kinds of forms. For example, this 0-point energy wand is hyped on the internet. And the claim is that it can basically cure whatever ails you. It facilitates body healing. It can energize foods and liquids, energize the body, improve the immune system, everything. Everything that you've ever dreamed of, this rod can do. And I first saw this advertised, it was about $300. I thought, well, it really isn't worth that, although I do have a little museum in my office where I collect various kinds of quack devices. And I thought this is a great candidate. But $300 was a bit much. One day, though, I saw it on sale for $75. And that I figured was worth it. So I bought it. So it comes and it basically looks like a pen, except that it doesn't have any kind of a nib. It just sealed at that end. It was just a piece of metal. And you were to hover it over part of the body was ailing, and it was supposed to cure it. I didn't know what on earth this was. I thought, gee, you know, is it possible that maybe it has something in it, a radioactive source or something that doesn't? So I went to a friend of mine who was a dentist, and we x-rayed this thing. And what did we find? It is nothing but a solid piece of metal. Very lucrative for whoever manufactures this. And yet you have people, 30% of the population who tries this thing tells you how much better they feel. And I don't know if it works remotely, but maybe if you just look at this picture, maybe you'll feel better. So of course, again, here we're talking about the power of the mind. And it takes on many different forms. We're all familiar with the good old-fashioned snake oil. These products were very popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And these medicines were actually called snake oil. It was supposed to have the oil of a snake in there. These were sold for arthritis. Why? Because apparently snakes do not suffer from that affliction. They're supple, they curve all over the place, right? Well, the idea was that you take the snake oil and maybe it will lubricate you on the inside. Of course, most of the time, it didn't even contain snake oil because snakes didn't so readily give up their oil. It didn't matter. As long as people thought that it had some curative effect, it worked a great deal of the time. But because it has really no biological activity, we've come to use the term snake oil to describe any ineffective treatment. And we still have proponents of snake oil around today. Many different versions of snake oil salesmen out there. The one on the left, you may recognize Dr. Oz, and we'll talk about him in a moment, but he at least has some medical knowledge. He, of course, is an accomplished cardiovascular surgeon, so he should know what he's talking about. The one on the right, of course, has a very questionable medical background, and yet that has not stopped him from suggesting that people can get rid of the coronavirus on their inside by using some kind of a disinfectant. Well, I think the less said about medical advice coming from such a person, the better. But let's get back to Dr. Oz, who really should know better. And if you've ever watched the Dr. Oz show, you know that miracles come fast and furious. And he does not worry about using the term miracle. 1 week, it may be raspberry ketones, which are going to melt the fat off of your body. Never mind that there's absolutely no scientific evidence for this, which of course he knows. But I think these days, Dr. Oz has become an actor playing the role of Dr. Oz on television. And I think he has let his critical thinking just fly out the window. So anyway, one day it may be raspberry ketone, the other day it is a homeopathic starter kit that he is selling. And this is something that I take great issue with, because I think homeopathy is the most absurd of all the so-called alternative treatments. Non-existent molecules do not cure existing diseases, and yet that is exactly what we have. In homeopathy, a 200-year-old folly, the notion is that if a healthy person takes increasing dose of a substance until he develops some sort of symptoms, then that substance in an extremely dilute version will cure those symptoms in a sick person. This has absolutely no scientific merit. And the substances that are used in homeopathic solutions are in fact diluted to an extent where there isn't a single molecule of the original left in the final product. So for example, they would take some sort of herb and stew it up in water or in alcohol. Take 1 drop, add 99 drops of water, then take 1 drop of that, add 99 drops of water. By the time that you've done this 12 times, we have a 12C dilution, there isn't a single molecule of the original left. Not that the original would have any therapeutic value in the first place anyway. And then at the end, they would take a drop of this solution, which contains nothing, and put it on a sugar pill, a lactose pill. And what you have is just water that has been infused into a pill. That's what a homeopathic remedy is. Does it work? Yeah, it works about 30–40% of the time in any condition which is susceptible to the placebo effect, because that is exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking again about a case of mind over matter. If you believe that it is going to do you some good, it does. Well, sometimes that's okay when you're dealing with a condition that is self-limiting. But unfortunately, often people have serious conditions and they are goaded into using some sort of homeopathic remedy instead of some treatment that actually works. That is the danger with all of these snake oil treatments. In general, they themselves do not represent a biological problem. The problem is steering people away from treatments that may actually work. So the placebo effect is very real. Placebo, of course, comes from the Latin, I will please. And that's what these pills do. And it doesn't matter what they contain, or in fact, what they don't contain. In the case of homeopathy, it is the belief that they can do something that is effective. But of course, placebos do not cure viral infections. So when it comes to something like this coronavirus that we're dealing with today, any kind of suggestion that homeopathic remedies should be used is way, way off target. And yet in India, there are suggestions, even some government-approved homeopathic treatments. Of course, the fact is that when you have 1.2 billion people, you don't have proper medical care, and homeopathic remedies, of course, contain nothing at all. So there's no big risk in giving this to people. But obviously, there's no reason to think that they can have any kind of an effect. The one that they are basically using is arsenicum album, which is an arsenic solution. But of course, it is so dilute that you don't have to worry about toxicity. At a dilution of 30C, it is absolutely guaranteed that there isn't a single molecule of the original left. Not only that, there isn't even a single water molecule that has been in contact with a water molecule that was in contact with the original arsenic. So this is just total nonsense. Well, if the body and the mind can be connected in a positive way, is it also possible to have a negative mind-body connection? Well, think about this for a moment. You're lying in bed in the middle of the night and the telephone rings. Well, you know that it's likely not someone telling you that you won the lottery. So you rush towards the phone, you start sweating, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure undoubtedly goes up. Has anything happened physiologically? Has anyone touched you? No. So where is this coming from? Where's the signal to increase your heart rate coming from? It is coming from the mind. So this is a very simple example of a connection. And in this case, it can be a negative connection. Because if you get all anxious, triggered by some unhappy thought, it can have an adverse physiological effect on the body. So indeed, a headline like this, which of course we look at and is quite humorous, actually has some seriousness behind it. Because if you really believe that the visit of such a creature can be harmful, then sometimes it really can, because your mind will make that happen. I give you a very interesting example, and this one I like to use often because it's such a great example. There was a foursome of ladies playing golf one morning, early in the morning, and they're out on the course and a truck comes by and they feel a spray and they feel the droplets of the spray. They rush back into the clubhouse and they accost the greenskeeper, convinced that some toxic material has been sprayed on them. And one of them says, gee, I got a headache. The other one says, I got a rash. And the third one had the biggest problem of all. And of course, you've already guessed the bottom line to this story. There was a truck out there spraying, and it was spraying water. But these women were so convinced that pesticides, which of course are sprayed on golf courses, are terrible, that they actually got symptoms thinking that they had been sprayed by a toxic material. So what we're looking at here is sort of the evil cousin of the placebo. What we're looking at here is the nocebo, where if you think a negative thought, it can actually make physical symptoms appear. Well, given that the mind can do good things and it can do bad things, is it then possible to make use of this notion? Can positive thoughts actually have a healing effect? Well, let me introduce you to Norman Cousins. Some of you who are a bit more senior may remember Norman Cousins, editor of Saturday Night Review, which was a very famous magazine. He was an extremely good writer. And unfortunately, he was diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis, which is an autoimmune disease. It's in the rheumatism family. And it has a very low spontaneous cure rate. And there virtually are no good treatments for this. And certainly there wasn't back then when he was diagnosed in the 60s. And he was first put in hospital. He was very unhappy there because nothing was being done for him. And he asked his doctors if he could move out to a nearby hotel so that in case he needed to get back to the hospital, he still could. And he decided that he was going to laugh his way back to health because he had read some articles about the healing power of laughter. So he rented a movie projector because this was before, video recording, before PVRs. And he rented movies and he watched Three Stooges. He watched Laurel and Hardy. He watched the Marx Brothers, and he laughed and he laughed and he laughed. And within 6 months, he got better and he went back to work. And he wrote a bestseller, Anatomy of an Illness. Not surprising that it became a bestseller. I mean, after all, what a romantic story. You have someone diagnosed with a terrible disease, which has no good treatment. And all of a sudden, he laughs his way back to health. Of course, it was a captivating book. What we don't know, of course, is whether or not other people who read this book, who had diseases and who try to laugh their way back to health, were successful. Because if you're not, you don't end up writing a book about it. So what we have here is an interesting book, but scientifically, this is a study, what we call N equals one subject. It's an anecdote. It doesn't mean anything. But Norman Cousins should get credit for something, for planting the seed of research into this connection between the body and the mind, because this book really was instrumental in that. And since that time, we actually have had some interesting and serious research. I'll just give you one example here. University College in London, a lot of workers in there, and periodically during a day, they gave samples of saliva. And these saliva samples were tested for a variety of chemicals. And they were also asked to fill out a form. Every time that they were sampled, they filled out a form about how they felt at that particular time. Did they feel happy? Were they anxious? Were they miserable? Whatever. So the samples were tested for cortisol and fibrinogen. And these are both chemicals that are associated with stress. Cortisol is in fact called the stress hormone. And amazingly, it turned out that levels of these hormones paralleled what the subject said they felt. So when they felt anxious, the levels of cortisol went up. So here, for the first time, was some concrete evidence of a physiological link between what is actually happening in the body, blood chemistry, and the way that people are feeling. And since that time, there have been a lot of publications along these lines. Here's another interesting one for a different reason. This was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, Pathology in the 100-Acre Wood. And what they did was they examined the health status of Winnie the Pooh and other characters in the A.A. Milne story. And it turned out that they diagnosed Winnie the Pooh as suffering from obsessive compulsive disease. Tigger was diagnosed as having hyperactivity. But the interesting thing was that after this paper was published, the journal got letters to the editor about how this was improper, that a scientific journal should not be talking about cartoon characters and how they relate to life. Well, these people who wrote those letters had no sense of humor whatsoever. And when you don't have a sense of humor, you don't have the cushioning that this gives you. It's been said that humor is the cushioning of the wheels of a carriage that would be rumbling along cobblestones. And if you don't have the cushioning, you don't feel very good. Well, it turns out that this paper was actually a very serious paper. They investigated OCD and they investigated hyperactivity, or attention deficit disorder as it is now called. They just used an interesting vehicle in order to increase the reader's interest. It was still a serious scientific paper, but there were people who said that humor has no role in science. And boy, are they ever wrong. Because now we know that in hospitals, humor is coming to the forefront, especially in children's wards. You have what are called clown care units. Clowns go into the rooms, they entertain the kids, they tell them jokes, they do the usual stuff. And it turns out that the kids feel better, they need less medication, they are less scared of being wheeled into the operating room. It's just an amazing phenomenon. So laughter really can have value in healthcare. In India, they have organized what are called laughing clubs. They gather, usually in a park early in the morning, 7 o'clock, and they tell each other jokes and they laugh. And the claim is that they have a better day. They have a more productive day. They feel better all day. The only problem is that pretty soon they run out of jokes to tell. So what do? They still gather and they just spontaneously laugh, belly laugh. And it seems to work just as well. In North America, this hasn't really taken off, but maybe it will when you find out what one of the side effects is of getting together 7 o'clock every morning and spending some minutes laughing. What they have found is that these ho-ho, ha-ha clubs, as they are called, lead to loss of weight. And that is something that is marketable in North America. So we'll see whether or not this triggers the formation of these laughing clubs. And especially these days, I think we can all use a bit of laughter. But the question is, what do we laugh at? If we accept the fact that laughing can be therapeutic, you have to make a decision on what you're going to use to make people laugh. Well, it depends. Some people like visual humor. Some will laugh at a picture like this. Now think about this for a moment. Why is that funny? Why is spaghetti on a kid's head funny? Why is a pie in the face funny? Well, it's not funny if it's happening to you. The reason we think it's funny is because we're happy it's not happening to us. So that's one type of visual humor. And then you have cartoons. Now this is interesting because here it depends on your educational background and your social upbringing. To us, I think this is a pretty funny cartoon because we know what ties are, right? And then, but imagine that you showed this to someone in some society, let's say in Amazon, where they don't know what a tie is. This would be totally meaningless. Or if you look at this one, if you don't know the story of William Tell, this means absolutely nothing. But if you know the story, then of course it's meaningful. If you have not followed the debate about animal rights and animal testing, then of course this doesn't mean very much to you. But if you are aware of the controversies of animal testing, then of course this can be quite humorous, and this one even more so. Because what do cartoonists do? They usually take some sort of social situation and make it extreme. And that's what makes it funny. And of course, escargot have rights too, is kind of, you know, pushing it to the limit with animal rights. And if you don't know anything about vitamin B12, what that really means, then I don't think that you would find this funny, because it kind of, you know, makes sense. I mean, why wouldn't B12 be twice B6? Of course it isn't. And anyone who's educated will, of course, know that. So for us, of course, it's funny, but you show this to a kid who hasn't studied any science, they don't know what to make of this. But I tell you what is the most surprising thing about this cartoon is that it was actually generated by a nurse asking a doctor this very question. That is funny. If you are not familiar with the controversy of doctors being sued all the time, then of course this doesn't mean anything. And if you've never been in a hospital gown in a hospital, then you don't know what to make of this situation. But if you have been, then of course it becomes funny. So you have to know what kind of cartoon to use. And if you are politically astute, then of course this makes complete sense, where you have Trump dancing to Putin's tune. But if you don't know the relationship between these two, then of course this doesn't mean anything at all. So choosing what kind of visual humor to use depends on your audience and what you're trying to get across. The same thing can be said for jokes. if you're going to kind of try to entertain people and make them laugh and put them in a good mood with jokes, you have to think about what kind to use. And there are different categories of jokes. Let me try a couple on you here. You may like it, you may not, different genres. For example, there are religious jokes, such as the one about the rabbi and the priest who get on the train. And because the only two seats open are next to each other, that's where they have to sit. But they don't have very much to talk about. But this is going to be a long journey, so they figure, I mean, they have to somehow strike up a conversation. So the priest begins and he says to the rabbi, Rabbi, I understand you have a very interesting religion, but you have certain restrictions. He says, yes, that's true. We have some dietary restrictions. So the priest says, yeah, like I understand that you're not allowed to eat any pork products. He says, yes, that's right. The Bible forbids that. So no ham. We don't eat anything that has pork in it. And the priest says, but tell me, you hear people eating ham sandwiches all the time. You hear people having bacon and eggs for breakfast. Haven't you ever wondered what it tastes like? And the rabbi says, you know what? Yeah. Way back when I was very young, before my calling, I did have a ham sandwich. And the train rolls along, and this time the rabbi pipes up. I mean, the priest now thinks he's won this little victory. He says, well, but I understand you have restrictions in your religion too. He says, yes, but now we can eat everything. We don't have to restrict ourselves to fish on Friday. But I understand that you're not allowed to get married. And the priest admits, yes, we're not. We're married to the church. So Rabbi asks, well, did you ever wonder, and you hear all this stuff about, people having relationship with each other and how much fun it is. Haven't you ever wondered what it's like to be with a woman? And the priest says, I'll be very honest with you. A long time ago, before my calling, I did have an affair with a woman. And then the rabbi looks at him and says, well, hell of a lot better than ham, isn't it? Some people will, of course, understand that. Then there are the jokes about professions. The doctors and the chiropractor who find themselves seated on an airplane. And the two doctors get into a conversation with the chiro who's sitting in between them. And of course, chiropractic and medicine, this is like oil and water, they don't mix. And they're talking, they're making fun of each other. The doctor criticizes the chiro criticizes the doctor. At one point, the chiropractor has enough and he gets up and he says, let's stop this for a moment. I'm just gonna go and get some Cokes from the flight attendant. You guys want any? He says, okay. So he goes off to get the Cokes. And these two doctors are so irritated by what the chiro has said, and they see that he left his shoes in front of a seat. And they decide that they're gonna fix them, and they spit into his shoes. Well, the chiropractor comes back, and he gives each of the doctors a Coke that he has brought, and he sits down and starts sipping the Coke, and puts his feet into the shoes, and finds, much to his disturbance, that feet get wet. So he figures out immediately what has happened here. So he looks at the two doctors who are busy there sipping their Cokes, and he says, you guys, we gotta stop this battle between our professions. It's not getting us anywhere. We gotta stop this spitting into shoes, peeing into Cokes. Well, of course, doctors and chiropractors will understand that. Then we have some educational jokes, like a professor standing in front of the class, large class, biology class, and asks a question. Tell me, what part of the body expands to 10 times its size when it is stimulated? Young lady in the back puts up her hand and says, sir, I have to complain. Such jokes are not acceptable these days. You have to abide by the social mores. And the professor says, young lady, sit down. I have a couple of things to tell you. The part of the body I was talking about is the pupil of the eye. You know that when you shine light into it, it constricts, and you turn off the light, and it expands to 10 times its size. That's one thing I would like you to remember. The second thing I would like you to remember is that one day in your life, you're going to be very disappointed. I see you like that one. All right, one more like that. Engagement party in the pre-COVID days when you could still gather. And the prospective groom finds himself in a room with his bride's older sister, and they're all alone. And she calls him aside and says, I have to tell you something. Ever since my sister brought you home, I like the way you look. I kind of had a little crush on you. And I know that you're going to get married, and I will not interfere with anything like that, but you're not married yet. Wouldn't you like to have one last fling? And he says, no, what are you talking about? I'm ready to get married to your sister. I'm not going to have any kind of fling. He says, come on, no one's going to know. It's never going to happen again. This is your last shot to have a little excitement before you settle down. He says, no, 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 no. But she starts walking up the stairs, and various items of clothing come flinging down, and she disappears into the bedroom. He runs out the front door, right into the arms of the prospective father-in-law, who starts shaking his hand. And he says, my boy, you have passed the test. You have passed the test. I put my older daughter up to this. I wanted to see if she could seduce you, but you were upstanding and you just ran out of the house. That was great. You're going to be a great husband for my daughter. What's the moral of that story? Always leave your condoms in the car. All right, enough of that. You get the idea that there are different kinds of jokes to titillate different kinds of people. What is the world's funniest joke? Well, an English magazine ran a contest. People would write in their joke for a prize. And they had a panel, and the panel decided the best joke. And it was about Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes. They're out on a camping trip. And Holmes opens his eyes and looks up and sees the star and the moon, the sky. And he pokes Watson and says, Watson, look, look, what do you think? And Watson looks up and he says, Holmes, you know, all I can think of is that all these stars out there, they're like our sun, they have planets around them, maybe there's life. And all I can think of is how tiny we are and how insignificant we are in this insignificant little planetary system, insignificant galaxy. And Holmes, what do you think? Holmes looks at him and says, Watson, you fool, someone stole our tent. Well, this was judged to be the best joke. I don't know if I'd agree with that, but so it is, scientifically determined. But the fact is that while humor can be therapeutic, it is not enough. You have to know when to use humor, when it is appropriate, and when to approach a physician. And these things are not mutually exclusive. I mean, you can use both. But there's always the danger of thinking that the power of the mind can overcome a disease when there is some real treatment that is available. Now, these days, doctors get criticized that they rely too much on equipment, things like CAT scans, and they don't have enough humanity. And sometimes that is true. They're also accused of using medications over and over without really knowing exactly what the results are of these medications. The complaint is that we are an over-medicated society, and there is something to that. But you have to remember that there's always more than one way to solve a problem. And this is the case with what we'll be talking about here, about humor and how to use it. It is just one tool in the therapeutic toolbox. And you know that you can mix drugs with humor. These are not mutually exclusive things, but neither can perform miracles. The power of the mind is important, but of course, we also have to know when to rely on chemistry. Now, there's one last little bit that I want to talk to you about. And this is the role of magic in therapy. Now, what we're talking about here is magic that is not what you think. I mean, we're talking about pulling rabbits out of hats, not witches riding on brooms. We're talking about witches riding on brooms being hogwash. What we're talking about here is the good old art of prestidigitation. And I want to show you something along these lines here because I like magic. I've practiced it a long time since I was a kid. And we also have a program where we teach kids magic, especially in hospitals. And it has amazing therapeutic effect. And you don't have to have great skill. There's some very, very simple magic tricks that, that can be done. I want to show you a classic. Okay, we got full screen here. This is called the Professor's Nightmare for a reason that you'll see. And what we have here are a short rope, we have a long rope, and we have a medium length rope. And these are real ropes. I mean, if we were doing this live, I would, of course, let you examine the ropes. There are no trapdoors or anything in any of these ropes. And because we have 3 ropes, we have 3 ends at the top, and of course, we have 3 ends at the bottom. And when I bring up my bottom ends, I can show you all 6 ends at the top. So here we are, 6 ends, right? Now, you can see the 6 ends. Now, let me just repeat this so that you understand exactly what we're talking about. And I'm going to do this such a way that you can actually try to follow it. So remember what we started with. We have a short rope, we have a medium rope, and we have a long rope. Okay, and I showed you the ends. All right, I'm going to do again what I just showed you, so follow along. Now here are the 6 ends. I'm going to give these 6 ends a tug, just like this. And look what we now have. We have 3 ropes of equal length. 1, 2, and 3. And if I just put them back in my hand like this, I can pull out the medium rope, the short rope, and the long rope. Now this is a trick, of course, that can be taught to any kid. And I'm going to do something that generally magicians never do, but scientists always do. I'm going to show you how this is done, because this is something that you can do for anyone who you want to amaze. You just need to have 3 ropes like this, where 2 ropes, the short one and the medium one, are the same length as the long rope. So you can make this out of any kind of rope. Now all you have to do when you bring up the ends is just take the short rope end and interlace it with the last one there. And then when we pull, we get the 3 equal lengths. But of course, the reason that they're equal length is because what we have is this one hanging over the short rope, right? So it's all a question of sleight of hand, but it can be absolutely amazing. And here's another one that I like to teach kids, where you show them your hands with nothing in there. And it's always amazing when you can make something out of nothing, you know, so that you can actually reach into your hand and take out something. This is actually silk. Well, no, it isn't silk. It's actually polyester, but we're supposed to say it's silk. Now let me do this backwards. And this time, we'll just make it disappear. And the same way that I make it disappear, I can, if I so choose, make it appear once again. I can just dig into my finger here, take it out. Now watch this carefully. We just make it vanish, just like that. So that's a very simple trick to do, and kids absolutely love it. Let me do one last one for you. You know the illusion called the zigzag, where you take a lady and you put her in a box and you take out the middle? I like to do things on a small scale, because then you don't have to carry around big apparatus, you don't need big women. So instead, I use a card. We'll use the Jack of Hearts here, which I will put into my zigzag cabinet here and push it over so that you can see it. There's the Jack. And now I'll take out the middle. And I've really taken it out. You see that? I'll put it back. You can see the whole jack, and I will take it out. There it is, completely in one piece. Again, this is something that is quite easy to do, to show kids, and get them interested in magic. And the neat thing is that you know, when you get them interested in magic, it also increases their critical thinking. Because when you see a magic trick, such as this classic one here with Duck Henning cutting a lady in half, you know that if you see her head wiggling at one end of the stage and her feet at the other, there must be a scientific explanation. This is it, right? And magic is great because it's a mental puzzle. The reason it's so entertaining is because people try to figure out exactly how things were done. And this is what we try to do in the hospital. This is in the Montreal Children's Hospital, and you see the little girl there in the middle. She's a little Inuit girl who had a kidney problem and was brought down from a village way up north somewhere on an air ambulance without her parents, all alone, spoke no English, spoke only her native language. Now imagine this, coming from some village way up north, coming to a big city, to a hospital, which she has never seen, language that she cannot speak, no parents around. You can imagine the terror of that. Well, we went in there and we were doing some magic. And I'm not going to tell you that we cured her kidney disease, of course not. But what we did was, for a few minutes, we were able to bring a smile to that girl's face. And you see her smiling right there, showing some very simple tricks. And when you teach them tricks, they actually can then invite the nurses and the doctors into their room. And the nurses and the doctors come much more willingly because they're going to see something interesting. So we come to the end of this. And what do we take away from this? Unfortunately, there are some people who are only happy when they're miserable. Let's leave those people alone. But humor can be the cushion of life. But of course, there are other determinants as well. We have to eat right. We have to select our parents properly. Genetics are important. And I leave you with John Milton's classic line. John Milton, the famous English poet. The mind itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. And if you think about that, I think you'll recognize that this really is true. And you know what? If you don't like what I told you here today, you can just go and get a second opinion. And if you have any questions, I can't guarantee that we have all of the answers because there are some questions that just cannot be answered. But we do have a website where we do answer many questions. And we also have a newsletter that you can sign up for that comes to you free every week. And it has a lot of interesting and entertaining information. So I thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if we have any time for questions, do we?
Yes, yep. We have a couple of, I know we're at the 8 o'clock hour, but we'll go a little bit longer because there's a couple of questions in here. But Joe, thank you. That was, I'm still intrigued with some of those magic tricks there.
I hope so.
Yeah, no, I'm going to teach myself how to do this. So by the time we get to meet in person, we'll be able to show them at NEHA events. But just a plug here, I signed up for this newsletter after the first time Joe presented, and it's fantastic. I read it when it comes to, I think, on Saturday mornings or over the weekend, and it has really good information there. So highly encourage you to sign up, and it's really easy to do. So the first question, Joe, that came in is a question that says, is it best to try to combine actual medicine if needed that will treat symptoms with other means of treatment, such as meditation, positive thinking, etc.?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That can be a very potent combo. And as I said several times, these things go hand in hand. You just have to make sure that you are not straying away from treatments that may actually work towards more questionable ones. I mean, you know, meditation is clearly important, and things like yoga are very important. They can make you feel better. They can reduce stress. But you know, if you're dealing with a chemical problem in your body, That's not going to resolve like that. So yes, these go hand in hand.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Another question that came in is speaking to the current time. I find myself often being able to find life in a lighter form, but lately I find myself moody and not being able to be upbeat and find humor in life due to homeschooling, work, finances, etc. How do we find humor with the balance of everything that's going on right now?
I don't know where you're finding humor in financing these things. Yeah, I mean, humor can be everywhere, but of course, there's different things for different people. As I try to emphasize, you know, there's no universal humor. I mean, I get a lot of humor out of watching Trump's press conference. A lot of people don't see this as humor. I mean, I see it as ridiculous funniness. You know, that if you go online, I mean, there are all kinds of great tools. I mean, there are oodles of jokes out there. There are great cartoons, and you can you know, even streamline it. You can Google what kind of cartoon is it? A political cartoon, medical, lawyer cartoon. You can have fun for hours just watching cartoons or reading jokes. And when the jokes do, you can target exactly what kind of joke you want to read. So if you make the effort, yeah, you can always brighten up your life with a little bit of humor. Although I don't know where one finds humor in finance these days. That's a tough goal.
Yeah, well said there. But thank you so much for that, and thank you for the individual that submitted the question. The other one that came in says, I really like your point about teaching kids magic for the purpose of critical thinking. Can you recommend any resources to teach kids about what you shared tonight, books or online videos that you've encountered?
Yes, there are. Penn and Teller have a number. Penn and Teller actually have an online master class, which is excellent. Unfortunately, this is one that you have to pay for, but it's well worth it. Where they teach you some really excellent tricks, and they talk about the story of the tricks and the history of it. Anything that Penn and Teller do is very good. But there are all kinds of lessons, magic lessons. I mean, you go into Google, you put magic lesson children, you'll be inundated. So I off the top of my head, I can't give you any specifics, but you know, within a couple of minutes, you would find all kinds of stuff. And magic is a huge world. It's a huge world. You can spend 24 hours a day on YouTube watching magic for the rest of your life, good magic, and you'd be constantly entertained. I mean, some of the Asian young magicians now who do the card tricks are absolutely amazing. I continue to just wonder, but it takes a lot of practice when you're at that level. But you can also do some very simple things like the ones that I did, and just go to Google, children's magic, lesson, teach. Those are the keywords you'll find.
Great. Thank you, Joe. A comment came in that said, thank you so much. This was great. And a joke that said, so no snake oil for a knee bleed to treat hemophilia.
I don't think so. But you know, the interesting thing is that, I mean, we poke fun at snake oil as we should, but there actually is some real research into snake venoms, not snake oil, but into snake venom. And there are components of snake venom which actually have an effect on reducing hypertension. So there is research in that area, but snake oil really is a sort of a derogatory term for quack remedies.
Great. This is the last question that came in, and it's around, I'm going to paraphrase here, but they preface not looking to get political, but how do we balance, and I think this spoke to your first presentation you did for us, the truth in media and the truth with public leaders of
Yeah.
navigating our own responsibility with family and friends who may be posting conspiracy theories or just trying to find facts right now in a very social media heavy world where medical facts are not easily found. So the question is, how do we distinguish the best ways of understanding our role in society of medical facts versus fiction?
Welcome to my life. So this is what I deal with, almost 24 hours a day of fostering critical thinking, trying to separate fact from myths from nonsense. And if there were a magic formula, I'd be happy to tell you, but I don't think that there is. It comes with experience of learning, who is reliable and who is not. But unfortunately, it also takes a certain, degree of education to be able to foster enough critical thinking. You have to have some basics to understand how the body works, how chemicals interact with each other, the basic tenets of physiology, in order to really have an appreciation for what is true and what is not. It often comes down to knowing which expert to listen to. And sometimes the pseudo experts can be very charming, and they will seduce you. And we've seen this. I mean, there are numerous charlatans on the internet who sound so convincing. And unfortunately, the real scientists are not always that good at speaking and at convincing the public. And I mean, it befuddles me that we have these debates between the non-experts and the experts. I mean, the classic one that is now going on is this amazing debate between Dr. Fauci and the Trump supporters. I mean, here we have someone who's an expert and has been leading in his field for 40 years. And I think he has a somewhat more greater voice than someone who has no scientific background at all and who talks about hunches. I mean, remember the way the whole hydroxychloroquine story started was with the president saying that he had a hunch that this was going to be a game changer. Well, of course, it turns out that not only is it not a game changer, but it may be even worse than useless. How can you compare that to listening to someone who has spent their life in research, in writing publications? So, you have to have some sort of appreciation for scientific background and know who is worth listening to and who is not. And the seductive arguments are very often the wrong arguments, because, there's the old standby saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it usually turns out to be too good to be true. Life is not so easy. Life is hard. And these days, harder than we ever thought it would be. And there are no simple solutions to this coronavirus problem. This is going to be with us for a while. And there will be treatments that will come along. I think there's a good chance eventually that a vaccine will come along, but that is going to be a while. I mean, we hear these stories that, we'll have a vaccine, by September or by January, whatever. That may be true. We will have a vaccine, but it is the testing of the vaccine that's critical. And that you cannot take shortcuts in. You cannot test the efficacy and the safety of a vaccine in a week or in a month. That's going to take time. So although it is true that we may have a viable vaccine within a few months, the testing is going to take a much longer time. We're not going to have a vaccine that can be used in the public, certainly not before another year. But I think it is possible that we will have some treatments. I think that's much more likely. There are already some positive results with plasma therapy, taking plasma from people who have recovered from COVID and using that as a treatment, the antibodies that are present there. I think there's a chance that we'll come up with some drugs. I mean, remdesivir is the first one because at least it does something. I think it has been somewhat overstated. I mean, what it does is it kind of shortens the duration of the disease and people who are going to get better. But what we really want to see is whether or not it can reduce mortality. And so far, there's no convincing evidence of that. But at least it's on the right track. It's something that has a potentially positive outcome. So I think we will have that. We'll have more antiviral drugs and eventually maybe some sort of combined therapy. So it's conceivable that it will turn out to be, something like with HIV, where we still really don't have a very effective vaccine, but there are drugs that make life possible for people. So it's going to be a mixture of many things, but there's going to be no miraculous disappearance of this virus. It's not going to disappear when the good weather comes. I think there's a chance that we'll have fewer infections in the summer, but of course there's the real concern that in the fall it's going to come back with a vengeance if we don't distance properly. I mean, we're looking at an awful situation. That's the truth. It's hard to see humor in this situation. And if any of you have seen the movie Contagion, it's really quite amazing. That movie was made in 2012, and it's basically a carbon copy of what is happening now. And it foretold what would happen. They actually had consultants from CDC with that movie, but nobody paid any attention then. The researchers were telling us for a long time that something like this was going to happen, but nobody paid real serious attention. And here we are, trying to make the best of it, trying to put a little humor into our life with the presentation I just gave you. But I wish we had a more solid answer to what we can do about this virus. But for now, I think the only thing that we can do is the distancing, because there's no question this is very contagious, and it travels, especially indoors where you don't have good air circulation. I mean, that's why we're seeing the meatpacking plants, and senior citizens' homes, because you have a lot of people in an enclosed space. I don't think that's a big concern outdoors. I mean, I get all these questions. Should I be jogging? Should I be bicycling? By all means, you're not going to catch this outdoors by doing any of those activities. Just like in toxicity, we say that risk is equal to hazard times exposure. And that holds in this case too. There's a certain amount of virus that you have to be exposed to over a certain time frame in order to get enough viral particles into your body to be affected. So it's passing someone on a jogging path, even if they are exhaling, this is not going to do it. Being in a room with someone who is infected and they may be asymptomatic, that is the way that you can catch it. So in fact, it makes more sense to wear a mask indoors than outdoors. And certainly when you go into stores where there are a lot of people, it makes sense to wear a mask. But I think when you're out jogging or driving, as I see people driving in their cars wearing a mask, I don't think that there's much point to that.
Awesome answer, Joe. It's funny you mentioned Contagion, because I watched it for the first time this weekend, and there are a lot of similarities to that movie to what is happening right now. So highly recommend that, because
including the bat poop.
Yes,
that's where it originated.
Yeah,
but hopefully we won't see some of the consequences that we see in the movie, where you start having riots but you can't rule it out. I mean, we've come close to some of those riots in places where they have the demonstrations to open up and that. So it's a fascinating movie to watch. Absolutely. Disturbing, but fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, thank you. You have spent several hours doing the last webinar and this webinar for us. I know we haven't officially met in person, but you are definitely part of our community, the bleeding disorder community, the NEHA community. So we hope to meet you in person one day soon, but thank you for your insight and your knowledge.
Sure. Anytime. I've just worked up a lecture on dietary supplements on COVID. So if you're ever interested in that, we can do that.
We would love to have you back.
Okay.
You are the most engaging presentation that I have seen with your slides and storytelling yet on a Zoom call. So kudos to what you're able to do. You have a talent there. So thank you.
Thank you. And go watch some good stuff on TV. There's enough funny stuff there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, and thank you everyone for joining. A recording of this webinar will be up on our YouTube channel this week, also posted on our social media pages. We have a plethora of upcoming events that we hope you can attend that are on our website, nehemophilia.org, and you'll be seeing information about events like Family Camp and several others that are coming up soon. Next week's webinar is in partnership with Genentech and features a screening of an original video that stars Alex Bornstein, Emmy winner and bleeding disorder advocate, who will shed light on the emotional aspects of being a family in the bleeding disorder community. So Sarah posted the link to that. It should be a really engaging conversation. If you have young adults or teens, I've seen this already, and it's a great conversation starter for those as well. So we hope you'll join us next week or one of the events that we have coming up. Until then, if you haven't eaten dinner, enjoy dinner. And as Joe said, go watch something funny tonight. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joe. Have a good night.
Night.